This talk's pre-recorded to avoid the risk of an uncertain internet connection, but I will be live there at the session to join in debate and to answer any questions. And I want to start obviously by saying thank you to the conference organisers for just the huge amount of planning they've put into this conference and of course for inviting me to speak. As the paper title suggests, I'm going to be talking about quite a small topic to you today and really kind of doing this in the hope of bringing a type of artifact to the attention of you, the experts, and to get your comments and feedback about other examples you may know about or of other people who may have actually written about this before that I'm just not aware of. So, and I say that with the honesty that I'm not a Roman fine specialist. As a fine liaison officer for the Boards of Antiquity scheme for 15 years in Sussex and Somerset, I was inevitably a kind of Jill of all trades. And although I started with interest in Roman coinage and Roman objects, I've since moved ever later into the now working in the later medieval and post-medieval periods. But I was, of course, privileged working for the Boards of Antiquity scheme to handle a huge quantity of material and to be able to research and record many new artefacts. And it's two of those artefacts I'll talk to you about today. Now we have sufficient data to start really looking for regionality within the Roman period, it is clear we are finding it everywhere. In many artefacts, this is perhaps a case of proportional popularity of certain types being favoured over others in some areas, but for other objects, there's a very much tighter regional distribution is clear, and in which case we might posit regional manufacturing as well as use choices. My impression from working in Somerset is a slightly fluid but very distinct southwestern zone can be seen in quite a wide range of small base metal finds. And an example here on the left of the vessel handles with Y-shaped back attachments from the late Iron Age, but this persists through the conquest period with conquests spanning brooch forms such as the strip row brooch, and goes right into the 2nd century. On the right we've got a 2nd century Celtic face brooch, and of course this regionality may persist beyond that. And what I want to talk about today specifically is about one type of object that seems to be another component of this distinct southwestern zone. Let's start with Exhibit A. And this was shown to me at a rally about 5 years ago now. And I, to be honest, did not know what to make of it. I felt confident it was, perhaps later Iron Age, early Roman, that it seemed, well, it has a curvature of brooch, it's much more robust. And with this very square head and small projecting circular loop, well, obviously we do get roll-headed brooches in this period of strip row brooches, but obviously things like scissors and so on are also very popular. This didn't seem similar to those. So I, as we do, recorded it, made some guesses, moved on. Until about 2-3 years later, brought in this. And now I've got something we can start to work with. This piece has an old break, but was originally one complete segment, and it's clearly a segment of a large object. It's got hinges at both ends, and the similarity to the hinges, the projection arm fits exactly into the gap in the other, suggests that the original object was made of multiple identical hinged sections. Currently, obviously, it's highly curved, completing more than a 180-degree angle, but it was slightly unclear whether this was partly a function of distortion when it was broken. The similarity in the design between the two pieces is obviously kind of clear and striking. Both have a dual panel flanked by slightly swollen lipped decoration, which obviously is very late Iron Age, perhaps design feature, as indeed perhaps is the love in dots defining the panel on the kind of more broken piece, whereas on the complete piece the central panel is decorated down the centre with a row of shallow S-shaped stamped decoration, and the kind of hinge on both of them is flanked by this raised line within the designs, creating a kind of cable design. Both of those obviously design features that are familiar from Roman cuff bracelets such as the amaryllis and also other Roman dress accessories. So now I've got some things. My next step, of course, was to look for more of them. So far, I've not found any identical pieces, but there are several on the Pierce database which seem to have similar hinged ends. whereas trapezoid or rectangular projection on one fits into a slot on the other, flanked in some cases by slight wings. Note is top right from Wiltshire, which is also a complete section with hinges at each end. The decoration on this is much plainer, however, than the two Somerset examples, and perhaps quite close to certain brooch types such as Alcissa and Hod Hill of the mid to late 1st century AD. And that similarity I find particularly interesting given the wings, which on these types, which of course are also similar to brooches. The one below from Monmouthshire has a similar distinctive trapezoid slot, but in this case has a globular pinhead rather than wings. What I find really interesting is this looks like similar to the wings from Somerset, which had incised lines separating the end of the wing from the main piece, but obviously kind of practically and technologically it's very different. So it looks the same, but wasn't made the same. This example from Monmouthshire was paralleled by the recorder, Andrew Bolton, to an example excavated from a pre-flavouring context in Usk, where it was identified in the report as a buckle plate. I haven't seen it in person, I've only seen it from the report, so can't be sure, but it did look possibly like one of these. Also from an excavated context is an example of the wing type from Banwell in North Somerset, shown to me by Naomi Payne. Unfortunately, that was from quite a mixed context of 1st to 4th century date. Finally, there's one from East Dorset, which is described not photographed on PAS, which interestingly had a cell containing blue enamel. So these other examples kind of expand that decorative repertoire. The Monmouthshire example clearly echoes Roman cuff bracelets of the immediate coast conquest period, while the Wiltshire example makes a very clear link to brooch like the Alcissa types, again immediately post-conquest, and the example introducing possibly blue enamel, which may suggest a slightly later date. Then moved on to kind of related but slightly different types of examples. The top right example from Laycock has similarities, particularly to the Monmouth examples, but due to its incompleteness, it could also be parallel to single hinged objects. The two examples shown below have kind of lack the characteristic wings. One here does have a hinge both ends, and is reused as, in this case, a finger ring, which is a common fate obviously of bracelet segments in the 4th and 5th century. It's examined by Ellen Swift. And this example, to my eyes, has quite clear design links to breeder bracelets and torques. The other has interesting kind of design similarities to my Somerset examples, again with shallow lips flanking central panel. So we've got quite a kind of distinctive group of curved copper alloy objects hinged at both ends, with decorative traits that echo Iron Age and early Roman design features, a mix seen in a lot of 1st century objects in Western Britain. More broadly, we've got some kind of other incomplete hinged items which may or may not be related, and the curve, as you can see, you can see where I'm going clearly, that the curve suggests a bracelet, varying from quite small 48 millimeters in internal diameter to perhaps 78 millimeters, but because they're all complete, there are a lot of damage, a lot of distortion, those projections are quite tentative. Location-wise, these objects are closely spaced around Somerset and adjacent areas of South Wales, with outliers in Wiltshire and East Dorset. So moving on to research into Roman hinge bracelets brought up several related types. First of all, there were two complete double-hinged copper alloy examples from Brachydinus in North Wales. Unfortunately, they're antiquarian finds, so the context isn't great, but they're possibly 1st century AD, and they seem to find very close parallels to the Monmouthshire and Usk examples. Similarly, here's the Monmouthshire one, that are strip-like. They have these globular-headed pins flanking the hinge, and they also have these further kind of globular decorations to either side of the hinge, actually on the bracelet itself. And the example from Laycock might be of this form, but it may also be a single-hinged bracelet type found across southern Britain in the 1st century AD. On the top right here, this complete bracelet from the West Midlands has a single hinge, but the form seems quite related to the Raxel type collars of the, as well as to kind of Iron Age and early Roman beaded and segmented bracelets like this double hinged example bottom right. The well, there are double hinged beaded bracelets that design-wise seem to go right back into the Middle Iron Age with echoes of the Hallstatt design. They do obviously, as Roseanne discussed, go right into the 1st century AD, and as well as double hinged example here, there are also multi-segmented hinge examples found in Dorset. The double hinged bracelet segment, which was formed into a finger ring from the West Midlands, kind of seems to sit very nicely with this other West Midland example. There are also, of course, hinged bracelets in silver and gold, and these often feature multiple hinged sections flanking a kind of central stone or glass set section. But I find it slightly difficult to posit an entire extra section for these double hinged bracelets that we don't have and we've never seen. So I think, Occam's rays would suggest that given we know there are double hinged bracelets in the Roman period that are formed of just 2 segments, it's reasonable to suggest that these new winged bracelets are also simply formed of 2 identical segments, which unfortunately we've only ever found one of so far. An obvious other connection, as well as to bracelets, as already said, the West Midlands ones, is to the late Iron Age and Roman hinged items such as the Wraxel type collars. And here's an example from Dorset on the left, now in the British Museum. And you can see the hinge is very similar to the kind of hinges we're looking at on these positive bracelets. Here's just another example of a section of one recently recorded by the PS from Surrey. There is some variation, obviously, within the Wraxel type collars. Both the example actually from Somerset, from Wraxel, has a more a flatter hinge that kind of abuts that way, if that makes sense, rather than hinging that way as these do and as the bracelets do. And some others have a much more kind of globular hinge, like the recent example from Pentyre in Cornwall, which Nakowski et al. Have suggested link that example into the beaded talk group. So interesting, because we've got these double hinged things that also seem to link to that. McGaw suggested these collars, which were found across Cornwall, Somerset, Dorset and Wales. Like I say, a very similar distribution to these hinged bracelets I'm talking about. Dated probably the collars dated to the mid to late 1st century. And he's just they'll kind of work a small and local school of metalwork, kind of fitting again with this suggestion of regional production and tradition suggested here. Thinking back to the pieces I originally found as parallels, the piece from Carlin is particularly similar to the collars, both in having kind of Celtic, late Iron Age sort of decoration, but also lacking the wings. But the projected internal diameter of that piece at 78mm is kind of slightly big for a bracelet, but it's really quite small for a collar. So I would be happier placing it with bracelets for now, but as always with incomplete things, there's a space for interpretation there. Interestingly, an example of a Wraxel type torque or collar from Boveton in South Wales was found in 2005 with hinged bracelets, but not this form of hinged bracelets, annoyingly. They were strip or band types with single hinge and then abutting ends, a type that's quite common in the 1st century AD across southern England, unlike these double hinged types. And well, the Boveton burial dated to the mid-2nd century, and Sir Adam Gwilt has suggested that the collar and the hinged bracelet were slightly earlier, perhaps dating to 75 to 125 AD. Thinking in terms of further parallels, the presence of enamel on some of the collars of this group, as well as on the hinged gold bracelet from Riada, now in the British Museum, it's interesting in the light of the enamel on the unphotographed example of the double hinged bracelet from East Dorset, but I don't think we can kind of say more without a photograph of that piece. So I just want to go on to show a quick map of all these pieces, and it brings out 2 distinct groups in terms of these hinged bracelets. The yellow stars, which those 2 examples in South Wales from Elsk and Monmouthshire, and also the Brachydinus one from North Wales, so quite a big gap between them. But also then a broadly subset focused one for the winged hinged bracelets, which is where I started. It's quite perhaps interesting to note that focusing on the method of hinging rather than the decoration of the Wraxel type collars. The Wraxel type collars are shown as squares here, but the ones with hinges like the Dorset example I showed you, which is shown in green, do again seem to kind of centre around the same area, rather than with the outliers more likely to show other hinged forms. So, in conclusion, I hope this paper has brought to attention a group of double hinge bracelets formed of two sections, hinged at each end and fastened with a removable pin, which were found across southern and western Britain, probably focused on the 1st century AD. Within this broad group are several variable types which show tighter geographical patterning. Design parallels and also in particular technological parallels to Raxel type collars support a 1st century date, which is not contradicted by the kind of fairly scant excavation evidence. The distribution of these bracelets adds another plank to the localised nature of dress accessory fashions and productions in the late pre-Roman Iron Age and early Roman period in Britain. However, to be so speculative at this point, I would suggest that just as with the locally modified T-shaped brooches, where we see them adopting a kind of surface similarity to fashionable new brooch types, but retaining their technological traditions, we can see in these bracelets a fashion which is quite widespread across, like say, Wales and across southwest England, but with local variations on this fashion, where things kind of can be made to look the same, but actually are produced differently relating to technological experiences and practice. And so a pin or a globular headed pin on one becomes wings on another's, perhaps produced by people who are more familiar with producing collars and also particularly with producing hinged brooches. Finally, of course, I'd just like to say I'd be very grateful to hear any other examples people know or of written evidence around similar brooches. Thank you.